But if God has a purpose in designing our universe, might we have to admit it doesn't necessarily involve us? There's been no evidence of any divine intervention to mitigate natural catastrophes that engulfed our planet. In fact, it's difficult to identify any divine invention since the Big Bang. I've only come across one factor that is inexplicable and might point to a divine intervention. If God has the ability to do anything, and at the same time knows everything, then why did he not intervene to save Earth from at least some of the terrible disasters that have befallen our planet? Hi, welcome to the 16th in our series, the Quintology Files. How do you plead? In the last episode, we raised many theological questions without the time to explore the detailed thinking lying behind what might have sounded like astonishing claims. I hope, if you've been following this series, you appreciate that I try to base everything on hard facts, on evidence, and where I make my own assumptions or conclusions, I'd make that clear in what I'm saying.
Firstly, perhaps you can summarize the surprising claims you made on the last episode?
Yeah. Well, amongst the many heretical claims that I made in the last episode, you may recall the following. I claim that man has decided that God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent. Having myself defined God as the designer of the way our universe works and has evolved, I speculated that the absence of obvious interventions on the many occasions where mankind almost became extinct indicates that God may have moved on. I claim the Trinity to be a man-made confection. I claim that Jesus never described himself as God. I claim that almost nobody saw Jesus as God during the first 3 centuries after he departed, and that it took extraordinary measures by the Roman state and the Roman Church to force acceptance throughout the Roman Empire. I mentioned Roman ignorance of Jewish beliefs. I challenged whether Jesus was actually the Son of God. I claimed the birth narrative in the 2 Gospels, Luke and Matthew, were contradictory and seemed fake, whilst parts were clearly plagiarized from ancient Egyptian beliefs. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes, I think that summarizes the charge sheet. So, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honour. Let's discuss a few of those claims now. For most listeners, those living in, say, majority Christian countries, the belief system is enshrined in society. From an early age, we hear Christmas carols, Bible stories, nativity plays in school and later in many walks of life, in film, in theatre, in songs. We become familiar with the Christian belief almost through a process of osmosis, that a benevolent and loving God made the earth beautiful for mankind, his creation to dwell. Man was always sinful and deserved lots of punishment. Because a holy God must extract a penalty for sin, he sent his only Son to die, and in a somewhat perverse way, redeem us by accepting the due punishment for all mankind's sin, past, present, and future. At some date, all the dead people will be resurrected, but miraculously, we will all recognize each other. Surprisingly, nobody seems to question this, really. Surely, few people want to be resurrected in the state they died. I think most of us would want to come back as either Venus or Adonis. But if our bodies are made new, how would we recognize our grandparents? how would they recognize us? Moreover, until quite recently, unless you were buried in sacred ground in a defined churchyard, you don't get resurrected. So it's a bit rough for all the soldiers and everybody else. Heretics were burnt and their ashes scattered to the wind to ensure that they didn't get resurrected. Although the modern church has a bit more flexibility. In fact, it's claimed that even if you're cremated, you can still get resurrected. I'm not quite sure how that works, but still. Wait a minute. By definition, resurrection is the old body standing up again. If you get a new body, that's reincarnation. That's a big heresy. But if we are to understand God and to learn what Jesus really taught, the evidence, some suppressed and some openly accessible in the Bible, then it helps if we set aside all our preconceptions, at least for the purposes of these discussions. The first challenge I raised was whether the omnis are correct.
Sorry, what are the omnis?
Right. God is omnipotent, has the ability to do anything. Secondly, God is omniscient. God knows everything. Thirdly, God is omnipresent, is present everywhere, simultaneously throughout time. And fourthly, God is omnibenevolent. God can only do good. I've said that these attributes were actually man's invention. We have no evidence, really, that God is any of these. Certainly not all of them, as unsupported by fact or logic. Omnipotent. This one's possible. The ability to do anything. From the evidence presented by the design of the way our universe is constructed and evolves, the intellectual ability of God is truly beyond our understanding. Intelligent design also suggests a purpose. It's difficult to envisage an intelligence making a fantastically complex and beautiful design for no purpose at all. Therefore, I conclude the majority conclusion is that there was a purpose to the design of what we are living in. Now, evolution is driven by the fact that there is constant motion. Atoms are constantly moving. Temperature will make them slow down. In fact, if you get towards absolute zero, minus 273 centigrade, theoretically we think that atoms actually freeze, but we haven't actually confirmed that. Radiation, which is by far the greatest proportion of energy in the universe, is unaffected by temperature. So, for example, light, photons of light are not affected by that. They're indifferent. But if God has a purpose in designing our universe, might we have to admit it doesn't necessarily involve us? As we've discussed many times, mankind and its immediate ancestors have been very close to the risk of extinction. There's been no evidence of any divine intervention to mitigate natural catastrophes that engulfed our planet. In fact, it's difficult to identify any divine invention since the Big Bang. Mankind has now built elaborate models of cosmology, which, when we run them, when it's iterated, the results are very similar to the structure and density of the universe that we can perceive. Now, that tells us two things. Firstly, we've got a reasonable idea of how everything happened after the first nanosecond of existence. And secondly, if God had intervened in a material manner, it would show up as a discontinuity in the iteration of our models. Indeed, this is something I've looked at for some time, and I've only come across one factor that is inexplicable and might point to a divine intervention. And that is our understanding that the majority of our universe mass energy is represented by what we call dark energy. The proportion of dark energy changed significantly about 7 to 8 billion years ago. We don't know why, we haven't worked that out yet. Maybe God intervened for some reason to do that. That's the only thing that doesn't work in our models. Interestingly, that is like 3 billion years before our star formed. So it seems pretty unconnected with us. Now, I agree, by not intervening, that doesn't mean that God cannot intervene. It's just that we don't see any evidence for it. Now we enter more uncomfortable territory. Omniscient. God knows everything. This sounds like something you say to children to frighten them. Why would a super intellect even want to know everything? This is different to saying whether God is able to find out anything that takes place. But logically, an intelligence would want to prioritize. If God has the ability to do anything, and at the same time knows everything, then why did he not intervene to save Earth from at least some of the terrible disasters that have befallen our planet? On a much lower scale, why not intervene to disable or divert the planes that struck Twin Towers? Some people make the most amazing excuses for God in this area. We don't understand God's plan. It's all part of a grand plan that God has, that we're not privy to, etc. God must have a purpose. The third omni, omnipresent, that God is everywhere and everywhen. It's existed throughout time. In fact, some theologians even claim that God exists outside of time. Difficult for us to even comprehend that. But again, it paints God in a rather poor light. If God does know everything that's happening, he'll be aware of natural disasters before they actually occur. If there's a meteor coming towards us, he should know. If some evil person is planning a devastating event, he should know, but he doesn't intervene. So it's not too promising. Omnibenevolent, God can only do good. I think most people would define this as also doing good includes diverting evil. Logically, if mainstream Christian theology is right, a God who is everywhere at all times and knows everything, including the planning of evil acts, holding the power to do something, anything to interrupt, yet we have no evidence of any intervention whatsoever. Multitudes of innocent lives, even taking the original sin argument, unborn babies and the newly born are still regarded as innocent, but thousands are killed daily by evil humans' actions. So it seems we have seriously misunderstood God. The designer of our universe drew up physical rules of exquisite complexity to drive the evolution of our universe, with an almost unlimited mass energy from which a tiny 4% is condensed into matter. From this fragment of creation has come all the stars, planets, moons. What an amazing work of art. In our arrogance, we somehow think all this was made for us. A little humility might be in order here.
Are we so good that we deserve attention?
Well, as we've taken such good care of this planet, maybe we're a model to raise as an example for other intelligent species. Amongst the hundreds of millions of solar systems likely to exist in each of 2 trillion galaxies, perhaps there are solar systems that have evolved species more attractive than mankind.
If you were God, would you waste time with us?
Christianity perceives a God fixated on mankind as the pinnacle of creation and the focus of his attention. I think we need to grow up and get real. I think, based on what we observe, that if God had a plan, it was more like let 1,000 flowers bloom, or maybe let a billion flowers bloom. Given his foundation of stars, planets, and moons, each with their special array of roles and functions, maybe his plan was to wait and see what special species might evolve Which species offer me, as God, a species I can engage with, an intellectual challenge? We also have to consider whether God retains interest not just in us, but even in our universe. Perhaps our universe is one of a series of godly experiments to develop intelligent children, successors, or whatever. Maybe after creating our universe and defining the myriad rules by which the universe operates and evolves, God had a few bright ideas. Okay, I'll go down the road, I'll start another experiment. Maybe he's constantly improving, a process of continuous improvement. One thing, though, I think we can all be certain of. God, as the designer of our universe, never thought about asking to be carried around Sinai in a small wooden box. Well, having discussed the first 2 points on my charge sheet, the next episode will address a few more points. That Jesus never claimed to be God, and in the early centuries, no one believed Jesus was God. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you very much.